This is my mantra I live by in terms of how I see patients. And I've had this in my office since I first became a therapist. I truly do believe that wounds make us more beautiful, but they come at a cost. And that cost is often trauma and complication and loss and pain. And I hope you know that your wounds matter, your story matters, and I hope that this channel and this video helps us begin a journey on complex trauma and childhood and complicated childhoods, which I'm calling them, which help you to feel more seen, more heard, more loved, and more understood, and hopefully more healed. Let's get started. Today's video is all about complicated childhoods and complicated adulthoods. What are those? Stick around to the end and you'll find out. So many people are walking around wounded. We are the walking wounded from our childhoods. And yet when we talk about trauma and complex trauma, what I find is that in those cases that all of us believe are traumatic, it's easier to identify as, yes, I am a child who had a traumatic childhood. But a lot of the time, people in my office don't really know that what they are talking about, what they're dealing with, that their relationships and mental health are often directly related to a series of traumatic events that they don't necessarily know were traumatic. Now, things like child abuse and neglect and death and loss and violence and poverty, I think we all know that those are traumatic. And we use this word childhood trauma to describe those events, which is an appropriate way to describe it. But the problem is we often have other experiences which are just as traumatic. In fact, sometimes more traumatic are these repeat, multiple layer, multifaceted exposures to situations where we felt unsafe, out of control, unable to protect ourselves. But yet, when we think about it, we say, oh, well, my parents drank a lot and fought, but I don't really see that as trauma. And so I thought I would go through things today that you may or may not be aware of do qualify as traumatic, especially because they often occur in conjunction with one another, right? So if your parent has a drinking issue, there's a good chance there are other issues going on as well. And that's very common, what I'm going to call today a complicated childhood. And then I'm going to give you some things that are basically complicated adulthoods that unless you've experienced, you may not know, but that those you work with or love or that you're neighbors to may be suffering through, which are traumatic and can be traumatic. Now, just a quick note that trauma in and of itself is different for every one of us. What I find to be traumatic, you may not, in general. But I would say that for most people, whether or not they display signs of trauma, if you were molested, if your parents drank a lot or fought a lot, or you were bullied, just because you think that you're fine and don't show symptoms, and because you do a pretty good job of navigating your life, which is great, it doesn't mean that beneath the surface there are residual wounds, all right? So before I get started, I'm Dr. Kim Sage. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I hope you will please subscribe and hit the bell, and that way when I post new videos, you'll get notified. And I really hope you will consider commenting down below and letting me know what your thoughts are, any feedback you have, and giving me a thumbs up if this is a video that you enjoy. All right, so let's get started. What are the issues that can also create a complicated childhood? The first one is having a parent with a mental health issue and or substance abuse problem. So this could be borderline, it could be depression, it could be severe anxiety, OCD, PTSD. Because when a parent is deeply immersed in their own wounds or just doing the best they can, which I believe we all are, it often removes us from being able to be present, from being able to always meet your needs. Now, no parent can meet all of our needs all the time, irrespective of mental health issues. But certain mental health issues, even, and of course, narcissism, all of these, as we know, really shape our interactions and our experiences and the way we come to understand relationships with ourselves and other people. Now, even with substance abuse, when a parent is intoxicated or on a substance, a lot of the time, it removes them from being present and aware of what is happening with you and to you at times. Whether it's taking you to parties and then things happen to you, which is also very common, or letting you get in the car with another adult because they were drinking but then something else happened. You can see what I mean, how that can begin to set the stage for traumatic events. The next one is experiencing childhood or teenage sexual abuse, whether it is by an event that, let's say, is childhood sex play, where you were playing doctor or nurse with another neighbor, another child, and or you were taken advantage of by a sibling's friend or a sibling or someone else in the family. I've often found that while childhood sex play can be very common, even if the kids are close in age, there's often a lot of shame, and it's done in secrecy. And it's done in secrecy because even if you're a pretty young child, you know that there's something about it, even if you don't have the language for it, that doesn't make it necessarily safe and okay. The other issue is that because our bodies are wired to respond sexually to touch and stimulation, sometimes it can feel good for some children. And so that can be really confusing. You know, I know this is wrong, but it felt good. And often that, while it can happen in a one-off situation here or there, if it's happening repetitively, there's often also a likelihood that other issues were going on while your parents were not able to protect you, weren't aware, were disengaged, and or you walk around just carrying this shame. And in my office, it often takes several sessions, sometimes over a year, before people will share with me this has happened to them. And even when they do, it can be very shameful. Even though it's a very common experience, it's often confusing. And so that can create a traumatic experience that can connect to your sex life, to feeling safe in the world, trust, and things like that. Obviously, any physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, those seem more clearly traumatic, but they can be sort of low grade in terms of maybe spanking with a belt, which back in the day was accepted, or slapping or grabbing or pinching, which technically, if you don't leave a mark, is an issue, but it is an issue. Using any kind of violence to discipline your child can be traumatic, and or using horrible language and calling your child names. That is emotional abuse. Calling your child a bitch or a whore or slut, or you're an asshole. Or, you know, I get it. Like I say, we all have our moments where we maybe grab too hard in a moment of anger. We have a spicy child, or things slip out of our mouth. And I'm not going to talk about that because that's a different issue. But I'm talking about the chronic, repetitive nature of verbal, emotional, or mental physical abuse. The next one is experiencing a violent event. So if you happen to see a robbery, or someone get shot, or you saw your mother or father abused or beaten, or you witnessed your sibling abusing another sibling, or you, that can be very traumatic and leave a lifelong mark on your feeling safe in the world as well. And it can be something that, in conjunction with other issues, which, let's face it, if your parents were physically abusive towards one another, or you or a sibling, there were probably other things going on that contributed to your difficulties today. Along those lines, if you had parents who fought a lot, even if they never touched each other, but they yelled and screamed and threw things and called each other horrible names and enlisted you in the drama, you had to become part of their fights, and you had to be responsible for calming down a parent, and you saw yourself as this helpful friend or a confidant. That is not helpful, not good for kids, and can be very traumatic. You begin to believe that this type of engagement and anger is appropriate. You begin to believe that you are somehow a caretaker and responsible for solving it for adults. And this parentification causes a lot of issues for kids down the road and can also be very traumatic. Obviously, if you lost someone in your childhood, that can be traumatic, even a grandparent that you were close to or not, but it's really a big deal if that grandparent was also your primary caregiver or someone you were extremely close with. And while death is a part of life, certain deaths can be way more traumatic than others, and all of them can leave a residue on what you believe about mortality and your life and safety. But let's say it was a parent who died, that is going to have a significant impact on you and your life and how you see yourself, and create oftentimes a lot of trauma and wounds that parents will think, well, they seem fine, they were young, they don't remember it, maybe they were, pre-verbal, they were little, or they were still in elementary school and they have a great stepmom now. That all may be true, but that doesn't mean that the trauma is not still lingering within and often hurting the person. The next issue is if you experienced severe mental health issues as a child. You were super anxious, you had OCD, maybe you had high functioning autism, something that often was maybe seen as normalized in your family but left untreated, and or you went to therapy but it didn't work, or you just felt alone in your mental health and it never got better. That can often collect with other traumas to create issues. Obviously, if you were suicidal, or someone else in your family was chronically suicidal, or someone in the family committed suicide and The reality is that when you lose someone this way, it's like a wave of ripples that affects everyone. The loss of the person goes way beyond the initial devastation of a death like that. It can affect us and how we worry about others. So let's say if I've lost someone to suicide, I will worry much more about losing other people, even my own patients. This can be a trigger. And so we want to keep an eye on those issues as well. The next issue is if you were left alone a lot as a child, if you had to figure it out a lot, make your own food, a parent was working or absent or just disengaged. If you felt that you were pretty much on your own from a long time, from the beginning of your life, that can create this sort of instability and fear. And as I said before, if that was happening because let's say a parent was mentally ill or they had to work and there were no other options, that probably means that other things happened to you too. And so that sense of being on your own and being abandoned obviously can create lots of mental health issues down the road and or traumatic memories or experiences. Clearly, if you had sex way too soon before you were ready, this happens a lot, I think, to young girls more than boys, but it happens to boys as well. Whether it is by another adult coercing you, taking advantage of you, or even someone close to your age. I think that a lot of kids may be physically feeling ready for intimacy, but are not ready psychologically. And let's say that happened in a way that felt unsafe or you gave in. That can create an issue of trauma around sex and feeling secure and can affect not only how you engage in it as it's happening, but how you see yourself as a sexual human being and what feels safe and what doesn't, especially if other things were happening in your life and that felt traumatic for you or was traumatic for you. Obviously, if you had chronic financial issues, you were always moving, there was no place to call home, maybe you were on couches in different locations. It can also just be with single parents. Lots of times moving has to happen a lot. And it's not necessarily that parent's fault. Parents do the best they can, but depending on the nature of it, and let's say there were lots of moves and that parent was also mentally ill and unstable. It's one thing to go through difficult times and having, a parent to anchor to who may be struggling, but is generally like, I got this, we're going to figure it out, it's hard, as opposed to a parent who can't handle any of it, who is just as destabilized as you are. As a child, we look to our adult parents to give us this sense of like, it's going to be okay. But if you don't receive that, and let's say they also have a drinking problem, you can see what I'm saying, where these all begin to connect and collect, and that can be really an unprocessed trauma that we can carry throughout our whole lives. Also, if you had school issues, academic difficulties that were left undiagnosed, untreated, you felt stupid, you were never seen, you were bullied. Bullying can be a huge source of trauma for kids. And oftentimes we think they're going to tell us and they don't. They just don't. And it's heartbreaking to find out that you didn't know your child was being wounded or hurt or made fun of or abused or kicked or beaten. And it depends on the dynamics, but obviously anything around school, given the fact that kids spend so much time until this year in a school building, in fact more time around peers than you as they get older, that those situations can be incredibly traumatic and really breach trust and sense of self and all of that can be very traumatic. So those are some of the childhood traumas that you may not have realized can be an issue. And if you're in therapy and any of these resonated for you, I would encourage you to speak up and talk to your therapist about them, to get some books and podcasts. There's a lot of great books on trauma. I'll link some down below. But it's important to know that maybe you had just a few of these. That doesn't mean your experience doesn't matter, isn't as relevant as the child who was sexually abused or did grow up in poverty. All of us struggle in our own ways, and it cannot be underestimated how much these early experiences affect our lives. In fact, I'm going to start a series on complex trauma, and I do think it's important to know that we really do believe that if we just put people in the category of complex trauma and we really looked at how mental health issues are affected in life, I think we'd find that a lot of them are not these labels of depression and anxiety. And yes, we need to be able to cluster and label for treatment, but a lot of these issues are deeply rooted in our early childhood experiences. And it's not about blaming parents, and yet at the same time, we have to unpack it. We have to look at it so we can heal ourselves and also not repeat those same wounds and re-traumatize ourselves, which we often do. Now, really quickly, I just want to say this to those of you who maybe you had a pretty good childhood and maybe, a grandparent died or it was a little bout here or there with something. But for the most part, life's gone pretty well for you. The problem for you is that sometimes when you have those you love who are going through adult traumas, you may not recognize how truly traumatic they are. And I really know in my heart that no matter how much I love my job and sit with people all day long, and many have similar stories, many have different stories, I can never truly know someone else's pain or story. And frankly, you can never know mine. But I do think that the more wounds you've had, the more life experience you've had, the more you can understand pain and loss and suffering and devastation. And at the core, we are all similar in that regard. But let me just quickly go through some things that you may not know are traumatic, so you can understand that just because you thought someone you loved or you cared about or you knew at work or your neighbor was over it, maybe they're not. The first issue is if you are a parent or parents of a spicy child, if you see me in therapy with your kid and you have a spicy child, you know I use this word all the time, but this is really about kids who are difficult. The parents may struggle too. The parents may have difficult temperaments. It's like a mismatch sometimes. And or you just have kids who come out of the womb who are just, feisty and demanding. And obviously certain parenting strategies help more than others. But the truth is that whether your child has, autism, high functioning autism, ADHD, ODD, OCD, depression, whatever it is, it's really difficult to deal with. It's especially difficult to deal with if your child has anger issues or behaves in inappropriate ways, physically or sexually or emotionally. You're not going to be sitting at a dinner party and say, yeah, my child keeps touching themselves in the bathtub, I don't know what to do about it. Or, yeah, my child pulled a knife on me and she's 8. Or, yeah, I had to call CPS or I had to call the police on my own child because I'm afraid of them. My child throws things at me. My child has temper tantrums. My child wets the bed and they're 15. These are parental shames and fears and difficulties we struggle with. But if a parent is basically sort of saying, I'm struggling with my child, and you've even seen their behaviors, maybe you've gone to a party at their house and seen their child act out and you're like, what the frick is that? Don't be quick to rush and blame the parents. It is a system. Oftentimes it's a combination of how the parents are being triggered, how they're approaching it, and this child who may have difficulties that are undiagnosed, that need different strategies. But you should just know that it is incredibly hard to parent difficult children. And we often feel misunderstood and judged and really ashamed, and we live in secrecy about it because we don't want you to know, well, why are things so weird between you and your kid, even if they grew up that way and it's a little awkward at times. Sometimes it's really hard and you don't want to throw yourself or your kid under the bus and explain it all. But just know that in some families, there are some really difficult parenting dynamics that are a combination of kids and parents. And it's really, really, really hard, not to mention families who have chronic medical issues as well. And so you can't always know someone's story around parenting, so be careful how you judge and try to be supportive where you can. The next one is divorce. I see this all the time because we have unfortunately had such a large amount of divorce in this country. People often think, well, get over it. Like, oh yay, you got to get a new spouse and have a party. I personally don't understand that. I understand being relieved, but I don't think that people understand how difficult and devastating divorce can be. And if you've sat in my office, whether you have kids or not, and we've talked about your divorce, what we often find is that your friends changed as a result of your divorce. They got over it. They didn't understand it. They thought you were being dramatic, especially if this is a contentious divorce and especially if it involves children. Let's say you're divorcing somebody who has mental health issues, who's a narcissist, who is depressed, who's unsafe, who has physical or mental, emotional health issues. You can't always keep talking about that either. And so you often carry this burden of toxic shame around the fact that you failed. And yes, that's what most of us feel when we lose a marriage. And you should just know that because you're sick of hearing about it or you're over it, or it's been a year now or 2 years, why can't they just move on? Maybe they haven't. Maybe they're struggling and maybe they feel like they're sick of hearing themselves talk about it, but they still need your support and love. And so please know that this can be a devastatingly difficult issue, and it does deserve support and love and compassion, and it can be very traumatic. The next one is issues around fertility and miscarriage and infertility and IVF. It is really devastating when you're struggling with getting pregnant and you're watching everyone around you at work or your friends, your family have babies with no problem. It really can be devastating and isolating to struggle. It can be physically painful. IVF can be difficult. You're giving yourself shots. You're having miscarriages. You're bleeding a lot. These aren't things also you're going to just be announcing, or you're just so tired of telling everybody, yeah, we tried again and we failed, that maybe people are trying still to get pregnant and you don't even know. And you start offering things like, well, it's God's will. Please don't say that. That is like the most painful thing to hear. Like God wanted a wounded child to come out of you, or wanted you to have a wounded baby. Or, well, just, hang in there. I mean, a lot of it is this, well, you can always adopt. Well, you can do this or that. Yes, that's all true, but oftentimes that's not what people want. Their hearts want to find a family, and they have a certain way they think it's going to happen, and maybe they are able to change that over time. Maybe they aren't, but all you really need to do is know that it can be very traumatic, and just saying, I'm here for you. I've got you. I just want to listen. Tell me how I can help you. Tell me how to support you. What can I do? Is really all they need. And just know that that can be really, really painful. The next one is, if you have someone you love or know who has a parent, partner, child, sibling with a severe mental health issue as an adult, just know that can be devastating. Or substance abuse issue. If your sibling has a drinking problem, if your mom has bipolar or borderline, or your dad does, you should know that it's also a very shameful experience and one we hide in secrecy, but that it can be very traumatic. How are you going to sit at an event at school and tell everybody that, well, my child has no grandparents here because I don't have anyone in my life. They all died, and one died by suicide, or one is a borderline, or one is a narcissist, or one has a drinking problem. You should know that this can be very difficult. So if somebody confides in you that they're having a difficulty with someone they love, same thing. It's great to know that that can be very traumatic, and the chances are, if a parent is like this now, it was also like that in their childhood, so they probably have trauma around that too. And so maybe all you can do is say, God, that sounds really hard. Have you ever considered therapy, or talking to someone, or checking out these books, whatever it is? But just know that that can be very traumatic and also very shame-filled. The last one I think that we underestimate and we don't give enough credit to is single parenting. Whether or not you have resources or not, yes, it makes a difference if you can put food on the table for your kids. But the truth is that raising children alone is incredibly difficult. And for some families, it's all about just survival. So whether it's just, trying to get through the day and provide food, or, this parent seems like she's got it together, or he does, and they have some court stuff going on, but God, they seem free from their marriage. I hate my husband. Don't assume that it's easier. And whatever you do, I think this is so important to know. And I get it, but if you are married and you are financially supported, for you to tell single parents that you're being a single parent this week, I think it's one of those things where you don't realize and you don't mean it that way. But if you were raised by a single parent, you might say it because you relate to being alone. But it is not the same as being on your own, worrying about your child's well-being, not having support and help and resources. And so don't assume that you get it because of that. That can be a traumatic experience, and many people don't find partners again, and or second marriages become more of an issue in the relationship. You think you're going to have a new partner, and then the kids don't like him, or vice versa. The kids are upset and angry. Many parents that are single bring in partners too soon and cause a lot of drama for the kids, and it depends on the kids and the relationship and their age and things like that. But you should know that's very devastating. And lastly, if you have not experienced these things, I would really advise you to know that complaining about things to those who are struggling in a severe way with these issues, you might want to pick and choose when you do that. Now, this doesn't mean you can't ever complain about your life and your story because someone else has it worse, like I said in the beginning. But, for example, if you have a friend who's a single parent and your life is pretty cushy, please don't complain to them about your life too much. It's okay to talk about things like school and this is hard and, whatever it is in some general area. But I always tell my kids, know your audience. Try to be aware of who you're talking to. Now, of course, with my closest friends, I just say whatever I need to say. And whether it's, I know they know I'm not judging them and or they're not judging me, but that's different. I'm talking about how we engage with people we're not that close to, like neighbors, other friends at school, parents, co-workers, and sometimes deep, close friendships who maybe aren't opening up to us. But just want you to know that all these things can be traumatic and hard, and we can't walk on eggshells, but I do think it's important in this culture where we just often blast each other to know that beneath the surface, everyone I've ever met is walking around with some kind of deep wound or wounds or traumas. But I do believe that, pain and wound make us stronger and more beautiful and richer in our depth. but it comes at a cost, and sometimes that can be trauma. So I hope you will stay safe and well. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, and I will see you next time.